Okay, our next part here is number 6 on the PowerPoint. Water jackets are passages in the cylinder block that allow coolant to move around the outside of the cylinder and carry off excess heat generated by the combustion. All right, so let's just show you real quick what they kind of look like. You'll see them more prevalent in a wet sleeve diesel than you do on a dry sleeve, but I have a dry sleeve gasoline engine right here. And so the coolant passages, if we can see, are all right here. All these holes around the piston or the cylinders and the pistons is the coolant passages. So in reality, this cylinder, all the way around this cylinder is hollow. And they cast it that way, they make the block that way so that antifreeze can flow through that block and out through into the radiator to cool off that coolant, which takes the heat out of the engine. We have a lot of things that are causing heat in the engine. One is the combustion. Basically, we're making a little fire, making a little tiny explosion every time this goes on a power stroke on the piston. But also there's friction involved, because the crankshaft has to spin and these pistons are moving up and down and the rings are in there rubbing up against the sealing up against the cylinder walls. That causes friction. Friction is probably the biggest cause of the heat in the engine. So anyways, now let's talk a little bit about pistons right here. In number 7, the pistons act as a movable seal that forms the bottom of the combustion chamber. Grooves are cut into the surfaces of the piston. They're fitted with piston rings that seal in the compression and combustion pressure and also control lubricating oil, the film on the wall of the cylinder liner. So let's talk about that real quick. So it talked about a couple things. Here is a piston. And these are the pistons that I think come out of these here, these 5.4s. And so if you can see, that would fit down inside there. And on the piston, there are some rings. This is a piston ring, if you can see that. See if you can see that. That ring right there, that's a compression ring. And there's 2 of them. So there's an upper and a lower compression ring. And so what these do is, if you can see, there's a gap on those. I don't know if you can see that gap or not. But right there, there's a gap, and that's how you put the ring on. So you can take this ring off by taking off the gap like that. And that is the ring that goes on the piston. On the piston, they have cut these grooves that those rings will fit into. Now you have to be careful because these are cast iron and they break really easily. So students break them all the time. They are chamfered a certain way to where they have to go in one way. There's a certain way to go to get them to seal. And so usually there's a dot on the ring, and the dot, wherever the dot is, will be towards the top of the piston. And I am not seeing a dot on this one. It might have wore off. It might be because it's a used ring or something. But anyways, they have to go in a certain way. And what these do is they make a seal, basically. And so that's going to seal. As you put the piston inside the cylinder, you have to compress that ring together, and that gap will come together. So if you can see that gap, I can squeeze that gap together, and it closes the distance. That is a measurement that has to be taken when you're doing engines. You have to put that gap to where there's a little bit of gap in there, like 20 thousandths, 30 thousandths, whatever, so that when the ring gets hot, it will expand, and it has room to grow, basically, and to close that gap. Okay, way we do that is you take the ring out and you put the ring in to the cylinder without the piston, and then you even it out. I use the piston and you just kind of even it out so it's nice and straight. And now you can see that that ring is overlapping the other part of the ring. So there is no gap right there. So that is really bad. In fact, that piston would not fit into this cylinder. If I were to try to put this piston with that ring into there, I couldn't do it. So what you have to do is you're going to take this and grind off a little bit of that end of that ring a little at a time and recheck it and recheck it and recheck it so that that gap, you can see it, so that gap has a little bit of gap when it's installed in the cylinder so that it can expand. Once it gets hot enough, it'll close that gap right at operating temperature. And then that makes that seal. And this seals the air on the piston. So with these on there, this seals the air between the piston right here and the cylinder head. And so if you see the piston would be right here in the block. Let's say this is the bottom of the head and the block is over here. The piston pushes up against the head and it compresses the air, and that ring helps that air to get compressed and not leak past the piston right here. Okay, so in other words, the air would just go past. Now there is another set of rings. They're right below those, and they're called oil rings. They're a little bit different. They're a different setup. They got a spring in there or a wavy type of spring, wavy type of ring. And all those do is because the oil in the block is underneath in the oil pan, right down in here, there's an oil pan. The oil gets splashed around and it gets up onto the bottom of the piston. Well, if the oil ring wasn't there, the oil would get passed into the combustion chamber and it would burn and it would cause the exhaust to smoke. You would get like blue smoke because it's burning oil. So what those do is those clean the oil off the bottom of the cylinder underneath this piston down in there on the bottom side. It scrapes the oil off the cylinder wall so the combustion doesn't burn oil. Okay? So, and there's a lot more to it than that, but that's basically a real quick overview of pistons right there.